In 101 AC, over 1,000 lords traveled to Harrenhal to answer one question: who inherits the Iron Throne? They came from every corner of the realm, gathering over half a year, so many that the little town next to the castle briefly became the fourth largest settlement in Westeros, behind only King's Landing, Old Town, and Lannisport. They sat for 13 days and heard 14 separate claims. And while they deliberated, 3 different parties were quietly raising armies. Supporters of both leading candidates reportedly formed armies. Corlys Velaryon was rumored to be readying his fleet. Prince Daemon Targaryen gathered sworn swords and men-at-arms in case fighting broke out. This is the meeting that was specifically convened to prevent a civil war, and everyone attending it had a contingency plan involving soldiers. That's the whole problem in one image. Westeros has a mechanism for peaceful succession. It works. It produced a clear answer, and it still could not be trusted enough for anybody to disarm. So here's the argument I want to make. The Iron Throne does not prevent civil war. It converts every succession dispute into one. That's not a moral claim about Targaryens being violent, and it's not a story about a few bad kings. It's a claim about design. The realm has 4 structural features that, combined, make peaceful transfer of power essentially unavailable, and I want to walk through all 4. Let's start with the one that should be simplest and somehow isn't. There is no law of succession. There are only precedents, and precedents can be overruled. Aegon the Conqueror took a continent, melted 1,000 swords into a chair, and never wrote down who inherits it. The Targaryens never formalized royal succession after the conquest. So when the first real crisis arrives, there is nothing to consult. Watch how it goes wrong. In 92 AC, Jaehaerys I's heir Aemon dies. Jaehaerys names Aemon's younger brother Balon as the new heir, passing over Aemon's only child, Princess Rhaenys. That decision caused a lasting rift between the king and Queen Alysanne, which tells you the ruling was not obviously correct even at the time. Then in 101 AC, Balon dies too, of a burst appendix, and the king is out of heirs again. So he calls the Great Council. And here is the part that matters. When the lords got down to the 2 serious candidates, Viserys and Rhaenys' son, Laenor Velaryon, they discovered that the 2 available inheritance principles gave 2 different answers. Primogeniture favored Laenor because his mother descended from the elder son. Proximity favored Viserys, who was closer to the king by generation. Both are real principles. Neither is written into law. There was no rule to break the tie, so the lords broke it themselves. And they broke it on sex. The male line takes precedence. Viserys won. The maesters never published the numbers, but the rumor was 20-1. Archmaester Gildain wrote that in the eyes of many, that council established an iron precedent. The Iron Throne could not pass to a woman, or to a male descendant of a woman. An iron precedent. That's a lovely phrase, and it lasted about 20 years. Because Viserys became king, named his daughter Rhaenyra his heir. And when people kept asking him about the ruling of 101, he simply ignored it. In 109 AC, he dismissed his own hand, Otto Hightower, partly because Otto would not stop raising the subject. Now, I want to be careful here, because it's easy to turn this into a story about Viserys being stubborn. That's not the point. The point is that there was no mechanism to say who was right. Was the Great Council binding on future kings, or was it advice? Nobody knows, because nobody ever wrote it down. Both sides in the coming war have a genuinely arguable case, and the realm has no institution capable of deciding between them. And notice how rarely the mechanism gets used at all. Across roughly 3 centuries of Targaryen rule, exactly 2 great councils actually decided the succession. One in 101, one in 233. There's a third vote in 136 that some historians count as a great council in all but name. That's it. The peaceful tool exists. It's used about once a century. There's a deeper problem hiding underneath that too. A precedent is not just weaker than a law. It's differently shaped. A law tells you the answer before the dispute begins, which is the entire point of having one. A precedent only tells you what happened last time, which means it can always be argued about by anyone who doesn't like the outcome. And in a realm where the losing argument gets you killed, everyone has an enormous incentive to argue. That's crack 1. Here's crack 2, and it explains why the stakes can never be lowered. The throne holds everything, so there is nothing to win except everything. In a system where power is distributed, a losing claimant can be bought off. Give him a rich province, a great office, a marriage, a title. He grumbles, he takes it, he goes home. The dispute costs a negotiation instead of a war. Westeros has no version of that, because the Iron Throne holds command of the realm's armies. the power to create and destroy lordships, the naming of the hand, and the wardens, and final judgment over every subject. There is no second best. Everything you might be offered as a consolation prize is itself held at the pleasure of whoever sits the chair, which means one man's whim can be catastrophic, and nobody can stop it. In 184 AC, Aegon IV, on his deathbed, legitimized all of his natural children and placed them in the line of succession behind his trueborn son Daeron. One signature. No council, no vote, no review. 12 years later, Demon Blackfyre rose in rebellion. That was the first of 5 Blackfyre risings across 5 generations. They ran from 196 AC until the War of the Ninepenny Kings in 259 and 260, when the male Blackfyre line was finally extinguished. Do the arithmetic on that. Roughly 64 years of recurring civil war, 5 separate uprisings, produced by one dying man's decision that no institution in the realm had the power to prevent, review, or reverse. That is not a story about Aegon, the unworthy being unworthy, although he was. It's a story about a system with no breaks. And I want to be precise about what the concentration of power actually does here, because it isn't only that the king can do damage, it's that the damage cannot be contained afterwards. In a realm with independent institutions, a bad decree gets challenged, narrowed, or quietly ignored by the people who have to enforce it. In Westeros, there is nobody withstanding to do that. The small council serves at the king's pleasure. The faith was broken as a military power generations earlier. The great lords hold their titles from the throne. Every possible check on the chair is appointed by the chair, which brings me to the third feature, and I think this is the one that genuinely locks the whole thing in place. If you lose, you die. So nobody can ever surrender. I want to show you the clearest example in the entire history, because it's almost too on the nose. In 233 AC, King Maekar died with no clear heir, and a great council was called. Aenys Blackfyre, the 5th son of the original pretender, was living in exile in Tyrosh. He wrote to King's Landing to put forward his claim. His family had tried 3 times to take the throne with swords and failed. He was going to try words. The Hand of the King, Bloodraven, wrote back offering him safe conduct so he could present his claim in person. Aenys accepted, sailed to Westeros, and the moment he entered King's Landing, the gold cloaks seized him, dragged him to the Red Keep, and struck off his head. It was then presented to the assembled lords of the Great Council as a warning to anyone with Blackfyre sympathies. Sit with that. A claimant chose the peaceful route. He was given an official guarantee of safety by the crown, and he was executed for showing up. To his credit, the new king, Aegon V, made his first act as monarch the arrest of Bloodraven for it, precisely because the word of the Iron Throne had to mean something. But the correction came after the head came off. Every future claimant had already learned the lesson, and the lesson was that there is no safe way to make your case. The dance shows the same thing from the other end. After Rhaenyra loses King's Landing, she flees, and watch what happens. On the road, Rosby refuses to let her in. Stokeworth allows her exactly 1 night. Duskendale admits her, but will not let her stay. Half her gold cloaks desert. She sells her own crown to buy passage on a Braavosi ship. She reaches Dragonstone, is captured by a garrison that is turned, and is fed to her half-brother's dragon, while her young son is made to watch. And Aegon II doesn't get an exit either. With 3 armies converging on King's Landing, his own counselors urged him to surrender and take the black. He was found dead with poison on his lips before they arrived. Both monarchs, neither could stop. There was no version of that war where either of them walks away and lives quietly on an island. And this isn't a dragon era problem. Generations later, with the dragons long dead, Aerys II demanded that Jon Arryn send him the heads of Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark. Jon Arryn's available options were murder his own foster sons or start a war. He raised his banners. That is the system working exactly as designed. 2 choices, both terrible, no third door. And this is the part that makes the war so long. In a conflict where surrender is survivable, the losing side quits as soon as the odds turn against them, which is usually early. Wars end when one side calculates that stopping is better than continuing. Take away the ability to stop safely, and that calculation never comes out in favor of peace. You get wars that only end when one side is physically destroyed, because destruction is the only exit that exists, which leads directly to the 4th feature. Nobody is allowed to stay out of it. This is the peace that turns a family argument into a continental catastrophe. And there is one detail in Fire and Blood that demonstrates it better than anything I could construct. When Viserys died and the Greens moved, to crown Aegon, his small council went and pulled the records of the Great Council of 101 AC. They read the old voting rolls to work out which houses had dissented decades earlier on the theory that those houses would side with Rhaenyra. And it worked. They correctly predicted that the Starks would back Rhaenyra, based on how House Stark had voted 28 years before. Think about what that means. A vote cast in 101 was still operating as a loyalty register in 129. The great houses were not weighing the merits in the moment. They had been sorted into factions a generation earlier, and the sorting held. And you can see why nobody escapes. Rosby, Stokeworth, and Duskendale were not neutral parties when Rhaenyra came knocking. They were making a choice, under threat, with an army somewhere behind whichever answer they gave. Jon Arryn was not neutral. The moment the Raven arrived, he was either a loyalist or a rebel. There's also a nasty second-order effect. Once every house knows, it will eventually be forced to choose. The smart move is to start positioning early, before the crisis, which means the factions exist before the war does. The Greens didn't create the split in 129. They looked it up. It had been sitting in the archive for a generation, waiting. So the cost of a succession dispute is never proportional to the dispute. Two half-siblings disagree about a chair, and, because no house in the realm is permitted to abstain, the resulting war is fought from the wall to the reach, with fleets, with dragons, and with tens of thousands of people who have no stake in which Targaryen sits down. Now let me put the strongest case against all of this, because there is one, and it's good. The objection runs in three parts. First, the system clearly can produce peace. Jaehaerys I ruled for more than half a century, and the realm prospered. If the design guaranteed civil war, that could not happen. Second, none of this is unique to Westeros. Real medieval monarchies had contested successions, competing inheritance customs, in dynastic wars constantly. Blaming a chair for that is blaming furniture for human nature. And third, the dance specifically is a story about people. Viserys' indecision, Otto's ambition, Aemon's grudge, Daemon's appetite for violence. Change the people, and you don't get the war. All three of those are substantially true, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. But I think Jaehaerys is actually the best evidence for the argument, rather than against it. His reign is the system running at absolute best case. Long-lived king, exceptional administrator, stable realm, no serious external threat, and he still could not solve the succession. He had to summon 1,000 lords across half a year to answer a question that one written sentence would have settled. And while they were answering it, three separate parties were arming. If your constitution requires a once-in-a-century monarch to avoid war, and even then produces armies in the courtyard, the Constitution is not working. It's just been lucky. The historical comparison sharpens it too. Real monarchies that suffered repeated succession wars are generally understood to have had a design flaw, and the ones that stabilized did it by fixing the rules, not by hoping for better kings. Westeros never fixes the rules. It has the tool. It uses it twice in 300 years. And the personalities objection, I think, is simply backwards. Every political system that has ever existed contains ambitious, indecisive, and vengeful people. That's the constant, not the variable. The whole question of institutional design is what happens when those people arrive, because they always arrive. A good system turns them into a lawsuit. This one turns them into a war, because it offers no binding rule to appeal to, no lesser prize to accept, no safe way to lose, and no ground to stand aside on. So here's where I've landed. The Iron Throne is famously uncomfortable. Aegon had it forged from the swords of his defeated enemies, and left it jagged. And the usual reading is that a king should never sit easy. Read as engineering rather than symbolism. It's more accurate than anyone intended. It's a device that takes ordinary dynastic disagreement, the kind every family in history produces, and reliably outputs continental war. Not because the input is unusual, because the machine removes every alternative on the way through. Aegon united 7 kingdoms into one, so they would stop fighting each other. What he actually built was a single chair that all of them now have to fight over,